What if I told you that everything you know about the Age of Discovery is incomplete? That hidden away in a fortress at the edge of Europe, Portuguese navigators were drawing maps of places that officially didn't exist yet. Maps so accurate, so detailed, that they couldn't have been created without knowledge that shouldn't have been possible. Welcome to Sagres, Portugal, where the world was secretly redrawn and where one of history's greatest cartographic mysteries still puzzles scholars today. If you're ready to uncover one of history's most fascinating secrets, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this story takes us. What if I told you that everything you know about the Age of Discovery is incomplete? That hidden away in a fortress at the edge of Europe, Portuguese navigators were drawing maps of places that officially didn't exist yet. Maps so accurate, so detailed, that they couldn't have been created without knowledge that shouldn't have been possible. Welcome to Sagres, Portugal, where the world was secretly redrawn and where one of history's greatest cartographic mysteries still puzzles scholars today. If you're ready to uncover one of history's most fascinating secrets, hit that subscribe button and smash the like. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this story takes us. I'm standing here, metaphorically speaking, at the southwestern tip of Portugal, Cape St. Vincent. The Romans called this place Promontorium Sacrum, the sacred promontory. For centuries, Europeans believed this was literally the end of the world. Beyond these cliffs, beyond the crashing Atlantic waves, there was nothing but monsters, boiling seas, and the edge of existence itself. But in the early 1400s, something extraordinary happened here, something that would change human history forever. And it all started with one man's obsession, one fortress, and a collection of maps that should never have existed. The story I'm about to tell you involves international espionage, religious persecution, stolen knowledge, and cartographic secrets that were worth more than gold. It's a story that mainstream history has sanitized, simplified, and in many cases deliberately obscured. Because the truth about Portuguese exploration is far more complex and controversial than the heroic narrative we're usually told. Let me take you back to 1419. Portugal is a small kingdom on the edge of Europe, barely significant in the grand scheme of continental politics. Spain dominates the Iberian Peninsula with its powerful kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. The Ottoman Empire controls the eastern Mediterranean, cutting off the traditional overland trade routes that had connected Europe to Asia for millennia. The Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Florence, monopolize what little trade still flows through the Mediterranean. Europe is essentially trapped, boxed in, with no access to the spices, silk, and luxury goods that the wealthy desperately craved. The overland Silk Road had been relatively accessible during the Mongol Empire's peak in the 1200s and early 1300s. But with the collapse of Mongol unity and the rise of hostile powers along the route, European merchants found themselves increasingly shut out. The spice trade was particularly crucial, and not just for flavoring food. In an age before refrigeration, spices were essential for preserving meat. They were also used in medicine, religious ceremonies, and as status symbols. A merchant who could secure a direct route to the Spice Islands could become wealthier than most kings. Portugal, poor and peripheral, seemed an unlikely candidate to solve this problem. But Portugal had one advantage: a long Atlantic coastline and a tradition of fishing and coastal navigation. Portuguese sailors had been venturing into the Atlantic for generations, fishing the rich waters off their coast and occasionally pushing further out to sea. Enter Prince Henry of Portugal, the third son of King John III. Born in 1394, Henry would never be king, which freed him to pursue other ambitions. And his ambition was singular and obsessive: find a sea route to Asia by sailing around Africa. Now, here's the first myth I need to bust. Henry wasn't actually a navigator himself. He rarely sailed anywhere. In fact, He was notoriously prone to seasickness and preferred to keep his feet on solid ground. But what he created was far more powerful than any single voyage. He created a system, an institution, a machine designed to unlock the secrets of the unknown world. Around 1420, Henry established what we might call the world's first research and development center for maritime exploration. The location, Sagres. This wind-swept, desolate cape at Europe's southwestern extreme, where the land literally runs out and the Atlantic begins. Why here? Because it was remote, private, away from prying eyes, away from foreign spies, away from the chaos of court politics in Lisbon. And in the 15th century, knowledge was more valuable than gold. Information about trade routes, navigation techniques, and geographical discoveries could make or break kingdoms. The Sagres complex wasn't just a fortress, though it certainly had defensive fortifications. It was a school, an observatory, a library, a shipyard, and a cartography center all rolled into one. Henry gathered the greatest minds of his age, astronomers who could read the stars, mathematicians who could calculate latitudes, shipbuilders who could design vessels capable of oceanic voyages, and most importantly, cartographers who could transform navigation data into accurate maps. But here's where things get interesting. Henry didn't just recruit Portuguese experts. He brought in Jews fleeing persecution in Spain, Arabs with knowledge of navigation techniques developed over centuries of Indian Ocean trade, Italians trained in the sophisticated cartographic traditions of Venice and Genoa, Germans with expertise in mathematics and astronomy. Anyone with knowledge about navigation, geography, or map-making was welcome, regardless of nationality or religion. In medieval Europe, this was revolutionary. Most knowledge was hoarded by guilds that jealously guarded their techniques, churches that controlled access to ancient texts, and royal courts that treated information as strategic assets. But Henry created something different, a collaborative, international, multicultural center dedicated to a single purpose, finding a sea route to Asia and mapping the unknown world. The physical layout of Sagres reflected this purpose. There was a chapel, because this was still an intensely religious age, and sailors needed spiritual preparation before voyaging into the unknown. There were workshops where the new caravel design was perfected, a ship that could sail closer to the wind than anything before it, making it possible to explore the African coast and still return home against prevailing winds. There were lecture halls where captured Arab and Jewish geographers shared their knowledge. And at the center of it all was the cartography room, where every scrap of information was compiled into master charts. Now, the physical evidence of this center is frustratingly sparse. The fortress was largely destroyed in the devastating 1755 Lisbon earthquake that leveled much of Portugal and killed tens of thousands of people. What the earthquake didn't destroy was finished off by English privateers, essentially legalized pirates, during later conflicts. When Sir Francis Drake raided the Portuguese coast in 1587, Sagres was one of his targets. What remains today are ruins, legends, a mysterious giant wind rose carved into the ground, and most intriguingly, those maps, those impossible maps. Walking through the ruins today, you can still feel something of what this place must have been. The wind is constant, fierce, carrying the salt spray from the Atlantic. The cliffs drop dramatically to the ocean below. At night, the stars are incredibly clear, unobscured by any light pollution, perfect for astronomical observations. You can imagine the cartographers working by candlelight, compiling information from dozens of sources, trying to piece together a coherent picture of a world far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined. Let me tell you what really happened inside those walls. Because the official history, the one you learned in school, the one in most textbooks, is sanitized, cleaned up, made palatable for public consumption. The real story is far more intriguing and, frankly, more morally complex. Henry's academy operated under a veil of absolute secrecy. This wasn't paranoia, it was strategic necessity. Portuguese sailors who returned from expeditions down the African coast were debriefed in private, away from foreign eyes. The information they brought back, precise coordinates, ocean currents, prevailing winds, the shape of coastlines, the location of safe harbors, was carefully recorded, meticulously analyzed, and compiled into master charts. These charts were state secrets of the highest order. Revealing them to foreigners wasn't just illegal, it was treason, punishable by death. The interrogation process was systematic. Each captain would be questioned by Henry's staff about every detail of their voyage. How many days did it take to reach a certain point? What was the depth of the water? What was its color and temperature? Were there birds? And if so, what kind? What about currents? Did they aid or hinder progress? What landmarks were visible from the sea? Could fresh water be found? Were there inhabitants, and if so, were they friendly or hostile? This information wasn't just written down, it was cross-referenced with data from other voyages. If multiple captains reported similar observations, the information was considered reliable and added to the master charts. If reports conflicted, further expeditions were sent to clarify the discrepancies. This was science, rigorous and methodical, decades before the scientific revolution supposedly began. But information flowed into Sagres from other sources too. Ancient maps were acquired, borrowed, or sometimes stolen from libraries across the Mediterranean. The Library of Alexandria might have been destroyed centuries earlier, but copies of many classical texts had survived in monasteries, Islamic libraries, and private collections. Portuguese agents, we might call them spies, scoured these collections for anything related to geography and navigation. Arab navigators had been sailing the Indian Ocean for centuries. They had detailed knowledge of Africa's eastern coast, India, Ceylon, the Spice Islands, and even China. They used sophisticated navigation techniques, including the kamal, an instrument for measuring the angle of stars above the horizon to determine latitude. Portuguese agents acquired this knowledge through trade, diplomatic exchanges, and outright espionage. In one famous case, a Portuguese sailor named Pero da Covilhã was sent overland to India and East Africa in 1487, disguised as an Arab merchant, specifically to gather navigational intelligence. He successfully reached India and sent back detailed reports before disappearing into Ethiopia, where he spent the rest of his life. Jewish scholars were particularly crucial to Henry's enterprise, and this is a part of the story that was systematically erased from official Portuguese histories after the expulsion of the Jews. Many Jewish scholars were expert cartographers, astronomers, and translators who could read Arabic, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, essential skills for accessing the full range of geographical knowledge available in the Mediterranean world. They had access to ancient texts that had survived from Greek and Roman times, preserved by Arab scholars during Europe's Dark Ages, as well as more recent Arab and Persian geographical works. When Spain began persecuting Jews in earnest in the late 1300s, many fled to Portugal, bringing their knowledge with them. Portugal, at least initially, was relatively tolerant, recognizing the economic and intellectual value these refugees brought. Henry recognized genius wherever he found it. His academy included Jacome of Majorca, a Jewish cartographer whose maps were legendary for their accuracy and beauty. There was also Master Pedro, whose real identity remains uncertain, but who apparently had access to charts that showed coastlines no European should have known about yet. The methodology developed at Sagres was revolutionary. Every ship that left the fortress was essentially a research vessel. Captains were given detailed instructions, almost like scientific protocols. They were to measure the position of the North Star at different latitudes using an astrolabe or quadrant. They were to record the depth and color of water at regular intervals. They were to note the flight patterns of birds, which could indicate the presence of land beyond the horizon. They were to document ocean currents, prevailing winds, tides, and the position of the sun at noon. They were to collect samples of plants, animals, and minerals from any new lands they discovered. When they returned, this data was integrated into the master charts by Henry's team of expert cartographers. Over decades, these charts became incredibly accurate. Too accurate, some historians argue, because when we examine surviving Portuguese maps from the early 1500s, we find details that shouldn't have been possible given the official timeline of exploration. Consider this: the Portuguese officially rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa in 1488, when Bartolomeu Dias completed his historic voyage. Yet some Portuguese maps from the 1470s and 1480s already show the rough outline of southern Africa, suggesting knowledge that predated official discovery. Similarly, the coast of Brazil appears on Portuguese maps with suspicious accuracy very soon after Cabral's official discovery in 1500, leading some historians to believe the Portuguese had already been there but kept it secret. Henry died in 1460, never having achieved his ultimate goal of reaching India by sea. But he had created the system that would accomplish it. He had trained a generation of navigators, perfected the caravel design, compiled an extensive library of geographical knowledge, and created master charts that showed far more of the world than any previous maps. His nephew, King Afonso V, continued the work, and subsequent Portuguese kings made exploration a national priority. The academy at Sagres became the model for other institutions. The Casa de India, established in Lisbon, took over many of Sagres's functions, managing exploration, trade, and most importantly, cartography on an even larger scale. But Sagres remained symbolically important, the birthplace of the Portuguese maritime empire. Now we get to the heart of the mystery, the part that keeps historians arguing and conspiracy theorists speculating. Portolan charts, highly detailed nautical maps, began appearing in Europe in the late 1200s and early 1300s. The Mediterranean portolans were remarkably accurate, showing coastlines, ports, hazards, and navigation routes with a precision that wouldn't be significantly improved until the 19th century with modern surveying techniques. But here's the problem that has troubled historians for centuries. We don't know where they came from. There's no evolutionary development, no progression from crude to sophisticated. These charts just appear, suddenly, fully formed, accurate, and sophisticated. It's as if someone handed medieval Europe a finished product without showing them how it was made or revealing the underlying knowledge base. The earliest surviving Portolan chart dates to around 1290, and it's already remarkably accurate. The Mediterranean coastline is rendered with such precision that when you overlay it on modern satellite maps, the correspondence is astonishing. Distances between ports are correct. The shapes of bays and peninsulas are accurate. Even small islands are properly positioned. This is extraordinary because medieval Europeans supposedly didn't have the mathematical or astronomical knowledge to create such maps. Latitude could be measured relatively easily by observing the angle of the North Star above the horizon. But longitude was a much harder problem. Accurate longitude determination required precise timekeeping, which wouldn't be available until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 1700s. Yet somehow, these Portolan charts got the positions of Mediterranean ports correct without this technology. Some historians believe Portolan charts were based on ancient Roman or even earlier maps, perhaps Phoenician or Carthaginian. The Phoenicians were master navigators who established colonies throughout the Mediterranean and even ventured into the Atlantic. The Romans conducted extensive surveys of their empire and created detailed maps for administrative and military purposes. Perhaps, the theory goes, some of these ancient maps survived and were used as the basis for medieval portolans. Others suggest they were developed through centuries of practical navigation by Mediterranean sailors, Italian, Greek, Arab, and Jewish merchants and sailors who gradually accumulated accurate knowledge of coastlines and distances through trial and error. According to this theory, the knowledge was probably oral and practical rather than written, passed down from master navigators to apprentices until someone finally compiled it into chart form. But the truth is, we simply don't know. The origin of portolan charts remains one of the genuine mysteries of cartographic history. What we do know is that the Portuguese took this portolan tradition and expanded it far beyond the Mediterranean. In the 1400s and 1500s, as Portuguese expeditions pushed down the African coast, across to Brazil, around the Cape of Good Hope to India, and eventually to the Spice Islands and beyond, Portuguese cartographers created new portolan charts showing these newly explored regions. And these charts, too, were remarkably accurate from the very beginning. The famous Cantino planisphere of 1502, for example, shows not just the Atlantic and the coasts of Africa and Europe, but also India, the Indian Ocean, and the recently discovered coast of Brazil. The level of detail is extraordinary. Africa's shape is basically correct. The position of Madagascar is accurate. The Indian subcontinent is properly rendered. Brazil's coastline, supposedly discovered just 2 years earlier, is shown with a precision that suggests either multiple detailed surveys in those 2 years or prior knowledge. Then there's the Jorge de Aguiar map of 1492, which some researchers claim shows geographic features that shouldn't have been known yet. The Martin Waldseemüller map of 1507 is the first to show the Americas as separate continents and to use the name America. But Waldseemüller explicitly credited Portuguese sources for much of his information. The controversial Piri Reis map of 1513, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly, was created by an Ottoman Turkish admiral who explicitly stated he used about 20 source maps, including several Portuguese charts captured from Spanish sailors. The Piri Reis map is famous, or infamous, depending on your perspective, because it appears to show the Antarctic coastline as it would look without ice, which has led to all sorts of speculation about ancient civilizations and lost knowledge. What makes these early Portuguese maps so puzzling is not just their accuracy, but the speed with which accurate information appeared. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, it was supposedly the first time a European ship had made that journey by sea. Yet within a few years, Portuguese maps showed not just India, but the entire Indian Ocean region, Southeast Asia, and the approaches to China with considerable accuracy. Either Portuguese cartographers were extraordinarily efficient at surveying and mapping vast regions in record time, or they had access to existing source maps, Arab, Indian, Chinese, or possibly even older, that they incorporated into their charts. Consider the Pacific Ocean. Officially, Europeans first saw the Pacific in 1513 when Balboa crossed Panama and glimpsed it from a mountaintop. Magellan first sailed across it in 1520-1521. Yet by the 1520s, Portuguese maps were showing Pacific islands, coastlines, and navigation routes with suspicious detail. The Diogo Ribeiro map of 1529 shows the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, with precision, including surrounding waters and islands. How did this knowledge accumulate so quickly? The answer probably involves multiple factors. Yes, Portuguese navigators were skilled and systematic in their survey work. Yes, they had good ships and instruments. But they almost certainly also had access to Arab and Asian maps and navigation knowledge that they acquired through trade, diplomacy, espionage, and force. When Portuguese ships reached India, they found sophisticated Arab and Indian navigators who had been sailing these waters for centuries. These navigators had their own charts, their own knowledge. The Portuguese acquired this knowledge, sometimes through friendly cooperation, sometimes through coercion. There are also persistent theories that the Portuguese had access to more ancient maps, perhaps Roman charts that showed more of the world than we usually assume, or even earlier sources. While most mainstream historians are skeptical of claims about prehistoric advanced civilizations creating detailed world maps, the question of where the Portuguese got their information remains legitimate and unresolved. What we can say with certainty is that Portuguese cartography in the Age of Discovery was far more sophisticated and comprehensive than most people realize, and the sources of Portuguese cartographic knowledge were complex, varied, and often deliberately obscured. Let's talk about what the Portuguese were hiding and why secrecy was absolutely central to their strategy. The Portuguese policy of sigilo, secrecy, wasn't just about protecting trade routes or military advantages. It was about maintaining a monopoly on knowledge itself, because in the Age of Discovery, accurate geographical knowledge was perhaps the most valuable strategic asset a nation could possess. By royal decree, all cartographic information related to Portuguese discoveries was classified at the highest level. The master charts housed in the Casa da India in Lisbon could only be viewed by licensed pilots who had sworn oaths of secrecy and who were closely monitored by royal officials. Creating copies of these charts without authorization was a capital crime. Foreigners caught trying to obtain Portuguese navigation information could be arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Portuguese sailors, pilots, and cartographers who revealed routes or discoveries to foreigners faced similarly harsh penalties, including execution for treason. Why such extreme measures? Because Portugal was a small kingdom playing a very dangerous geopolitical game. Spain was larger, wealthier, and had far greater military resources. France and England were emerging as maritime powers with ambitions of their own. The Italian city-states had centuries of experience in international trade and extensive networks throughout the Mediterranean and into Asia. The Ottoman Empire controlled the Eastern Mediterranean and had its own interests in maintaining control over traditional overland trade routes. If any of these powers gained access to Portuguese navigation secrets, Portugal's carefully built advantage would disappear overnight. So the Portuguese lied. Constantly, systematically, and with considerable creativity. They published false maps for foreign consumption, showing incorrect coastlines, fictional islands that didn't exist, and misleading distances and directions. The purpose was to confuse rival nations who were desperately trying to understand Portuguese discoveries and navigate to the same destinations. Some of these false maps showed enormous islands in the Atlantic that supposedly blocked easy passage. Others depicted the African coast extending much further south than it actually did, making the journey around Africa seem more daunting than it was. Meanwhile, the real charts, the accurate ones compiled from decades of systematic exploration and survey work, were locked in secure rooms in Lisbon and Porto, accessible only to the king, his closest advisors, and licensed pilots embarking on royal expeditions. Even these pilots weren't given complete charts. They received navigation instructions for their specific voyage, with details only about the route they would follow, not the comprehensive knowledge the Portuguese crown possessed. This system of secrecy and disinformation was remarkably successful for several decades, but maintaining perfect secrecy while simultaneously launching dozens of expeditions to Africa, Asia, and the Americas was always going to be impossible in the long run. Leaks happened. Portuguese sailors defected to rival nations, taking their knowledge with them. Foreign spies successfully infiltrated Portuguese institutions. Ships were captured by pirates or enemies, and their charts were seized. Ferdinand Magellan is perhaps the most famous example. Magellan was Portuguese, trained in Portuguese navigation techniques, and had sailed to India on Portuguese ships. He knew Portuguese roots, had seen Portuguese charts, and understood Portuguese methods. When the Portuguese king refused to fund his proposed circumnavigation of the globe, Magellan defected to Spain. The voyage he completed from 1519 to 1522, though he himself died in the Philippines and never completed the full circuit, was built entirely on Portuguese knowledge. The fact that Spain, Portugal's greatest rival, could accomplish this feat showed that Portuguese secrecy was breaking down. But before the breakdown, during the peak of Portuguese secrecy in the late 1400s and early 1500s, there's strong evidence that the Portuguese knew far more than they publicly revealed. Some evidence is documentary. Cryptic references in letters, royal decrees that make sense only if certain discoveries had already occurred, instructions to captains that imply prior knowledge of regions officially not yet explored. Other evidence is cartographic, maps that show features with accuracy that seems impossible given the official timeline. For instance, there are suggestions that the Portuguese had explored the coast of Australia decades before the Dutch officially discovered it in the early 1600s. Some researchers point to features on Portuguese maps that could represent parts of the Australian coastline, though this remains highly controversial and disputed by mainstream historians. Similarly, there are theories that Portuguese ships explored the Pacific extensively before Magellan's official crossing, possibly reaching Pacific Islands or even the western coast of the Americas. Again, hard evidence is scarce, but there are suggestive clues, Portuguese artifacts found in unexpected locations, indigenous oral traditions that describe ships that could have been Portuguese arriving before the official European discovery, and maps that seem to show knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet. The theory of Portuguese contact with the Americas before Columbus is particularly controversial. Columbus himself had lived in Portugal, and may have had access to Portuguese information that suggested land west of Europe. Some historians believe the Portuguese had already discovered or at least suspected the existence of land across the Atlantic, but kept it secret because under existing treaties with Spain, such lands might fall under Spanish jurisdiction rather than Portuguese. By keeping the discovery secret, the Portuguese could explore and exploit it without Spanish interference, at least until the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 officially divided the world between the two powers. What's not disputed by any serious historian is that the Portuguese knew far more than they publicly revealed throughout the peak period of exploration. The extent of this hidden knowledge remains debated, but that it existed is certain. The policy of sigillo was real, was enforced with severe penalties, and was effective at keeping Portuguese discoveries and navigation routes secret for several decades. The extent of Portuguese secret knowledge became partially clear in 1755, when the catastrophic Lisbon earthquake struck. The earthquake, followed by a massive tsunami and fires, destroyed much of Lisbon, including the Royal Palace, the Casa de India, and other repositories of charts and documents. Countless maps, navigation logs, royal correspondence, and other records were lost forever in the disaster. What survived, and what was later sold, stolen or scattered during the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars when French troops occupied Portugal, gives us only tantalizing glimpses of what the Portuguese really knew. Some documents emerged centuries later from private collections, monasteries, or foreign archives, where they had been sent as diplomatic gifts or intelligence reports. Each new discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, but also raises new questions. The full extent of Portuguese cartographic knowledge, especially during the crucial decades of the late 1400s and early 1500s, may never be fully known, because so much of the evidence was deliberately destroyed, accidentally lost, or remains hidden in archives yet to be fully explored. I need to spend substantial time on this because it's arguably the most fascinating and controversial piece of the entire puzzle. The Piri Reis map of 1513 is one of the most analysed, debated and controversial maps in the entire history of cartography. It sits at the intersection of legitimate historical scholarship, alternative history speculation and wild conspiracy theory, and sorting out which is which requires careful attention to both the map itself and the evidence surrounding it. Piri Reis was an Ottoman Turkish admiral and cartographer, a respected naval commander who compiled his world map in 1513, drawing on approximately 20 source maps that he had collected or captured during his career. He was not a fringe figure or a charlatan. He was a skilled navigator and scholar who wrote an important book on navigation called the Kitab-ı-Bahriye. His map was created using the best sources available to him at the time, and he carefully noted his sources in marginal notes on the map itself. The surviving fragment of the Piri Reis map, only about 1/3 of the original survives, shows the Atlantic Ocean, the western coast of Africa, the eastern coasts of South and Central America, and a mysterious landmass at the bottom that has generated literally decades of controversy. The map is drawn on gazelle skin, richly illustrated with ships, compass roses, and marginal notes explaining Piri Reis's sources and methods. The Atlantic coastline on the Piri Reis map is remarkably accurate. The bulge of Africa, the curve of South America, the Caribbean islands, all are rendered with a precision that demonstrates Piri Reis was working from excellent source materials. In his notes, Piri Reis explicitly mentions using a Portuguese source map captured from a Spanish sailor who had sailed with Columbus on his voyages. He also references other Portuguese and Arab charts, as well as what he describes as ancient maps. Now, let's address the controversial part, the southern section of the map. At the bottom, where Antarctica should theoretically be, there's a coastline. And according to some researchers, most famously Charles Hapgood in the 1960s, this coastline matches the topography of Antarctica beneath the ice sheet. Hapgood was a professor at Keene State College in New Hampshire who became fascinated with ancient maps. He spent years analyzing the Piri Reis map and other early charts, conducting detailed mathematical analysis of the projections and comparing them to modern survey data. His conclusion, published in his 1966 book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, was that the Piri Reis map showed Antarctica as it would have appeared before it was covered by ice, which would mean the source maps used by Piri Reis must have been created thousands of years ago before the ice sheet formed. Hapgood's work was endorsed by none other than Albert Einstein, who wrote a foreword to one of Hapgood's books. This endorsement has been used by alternative history enthusiasts as proof that the theory is legitimate. However, Einstein was endorsing Hapgood's earlier work on pole shift theory, not specifically the claims about ancient maps, and Einstein himself was not an expert in cartography or geology. The Hapgood theory has been enormously influential in alternative history circles. It's been cited as evidence for ancient advanced civilizations, prehistoric global exploration, and even extraterrestrial contact. The idea is seductive. What if there was a sophisticated civilization thousands of years ago that mapped the entire world, including Antarctica before it was covered by ice, and these maps somehow survived and were copied and recopied until fragments of them ended up in medieval and Renaissance map collections? However, and this is crucial, mainstream historians, cartographers, and geologists overwhelmingly reject the Hapgood interpretation. Their arguments are substantial and deserve to be taken seriously. First, the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map doesn't actually match Antarctica's ice-free coastline, as well as Hapgood claimed. More detailed analysis shows significant discrepancies. The shape, the orientation, the scale all have problems when you try to align them with actual Antarctic geography. Second, there's a much simpler explanation for what the southern landmass represents. It's the coast of South America, extended and distorted. In the early 1500s, European knowledge of South America was extremely limited. Map makers knew there was a coastline running roughly north-south on the eastern side of a landmass, but they didn't know how far south it extended or where it ended. The Piri-Reis map was created in 1513, only 20 years after Columbus's first voyage, and just 13 years after Cabral officially discovered Brazil. The full extent of South America hadn't been explored yet. Map makers of this era often extended known coastlines speculatively, essentially guessing that they continued in the same direction until either turning or reaching another known point. The southern section of the Piri-Reis map could simply be speculative extension of the South American coast, bent eastward to fit the mapmaker's understanding of world geography and to fit the available space on the gazelle skin. Third, there's no evidence that Antarctica was ice-free in the time frame that would be necessary for Hapgood's theory to work. Antarctica has been covered by ice for millions of years. The last time it was ice-free was long before humans existed, let alone develop the civilization and technology necessary for global exploration and accurate map-making. So the mainstream academic position is clear. The Piri-Reis map does not show Antarctica, and claims that it does are based on wishful thinking, selective interpretation of ambiguous evidence, and misunderstanding of cartographic practices in the age of discovery. But here's where things get interesting, and why I'm spending so much time on this. Even if the mainstream interpretation is correct, and the map doesn't show Antarctica, the Piri-Reis map still raises legitimate and fascinating questions about Portuguese cartographic knowledge. Piri-Reis explicitly states he used Portuguese source maps. This means that by 1513, Portuguese charts showing the Atlantic and the coasts of Africa and South America were already circulating beyond Portuguese control. The Ottomans, through capture of Spanish and Portuguese ships, were acquiring access to the closely guarded Portuguese secrets. This demonstrates that despite the policy of sigillo, Portuguese knowledge was leaking out. Furthermore, the accuracy of the Piri-Reis map's depiction of South America's coastline in 1513 is itself remarkable. The Portuguese had only officially discovered Brazil in 1500. Yet, within 13 years, maps existed showing the coastline with considerable detail and accuracy. Either Portuguese surveyors were extraordinarily efficient, or the Portuguese had prior knowledge of the South American coast that they had acquired from earlier, undocumented expeditions or from other source maps. The Piri-Reis map also demonstrates the international nature of cartographic knowledge in this period. Here's an Ottoman admiral using Portuguese, Spanish, and Arab sources to create a comprehensive world map. This shows that despite attempts at secrecy, knowledge circulated through capture, trade, espionage, and defection. Maps were too valuable not to be stolen, copied, and shared. There's also the tantalizing question of Piri-Reis's reference to ancient source maps. What exactly did he mean? Was he referring to classical Greek or Roman maps, Arab maps from the Islamic Golden Age, or something else? We don't know. And without access to his source materials, which are lost, we can't determine what ancient knowledge, if any, was incorporated into his map. So while I'm skeptical of claims that the Piri-Reis map shows ancient knowledge of ice-free Antarctica, I think it absolutely demonstrates that Portuguese cartographic knowledge in the early 1500s was more extensive and more widely distributed than official histories suggest. The map is a window into the complex world of Renaissance cartographic espionage and the circulation of geographical knowledge across political and cultural boundaries. Now I want to address something that's often overlooked, minimized, or completely omitted in popular histories of the Age of Discovery: the absolutely crucial and central role of Jewish cartographers, astronomers, translators, and navigators in Portuguese exploration. This is a story of extraordinary intellectual achievement, systematic religious persecution, and deliberate historical erasure. It's also essential for understanding where Portuguese cartographic knowledge really came from. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, Jews faced severe restrictions on their economic and social activities. In most regions, they couldn't own agricultural land, couldn't join Christian guilds, and were excluded from most crafts and trades. But they could engage in certain professions that Christians either avoided or couldn't legally practice: money lending, international trade, medicine, and scholarship. This created a class of highly educated Jewish intellectuals who excelled in fields requiring advanced mathematics, languages, and scientific knowledge. Medicine required understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and diagnosis. International trade required knowledge of multiple languages, foreign currencies, and distant markets. Astronomy and astrology, which in this period were not clearly distinguished from each other, required mathematical precision and knowledge of celestial mechanics. Jewish scholars had unique advantages in cartography specifically. Many were multilingual by necessity, reading Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, Greek, and various vernacular languages fluently. This linguistic ability was crucial because geographical knowledge was scattered across texts in different languages. A Greek text by Ptolemy, an Arabic navigation manual, a Hebrew commentary on biblical geography, a Latin translation of a Persian travel account. Jewish scholars could access all of these sources and synthesize them in ways that monolingual Christian scholars could not. They also had connections to Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, and even into Central Asia and India. These networks provided information about distant places, trade routes, and local conditions that would have been difficult for Christians to obtain. A Jewish merchant in Lisbon might have family or business connections in Cairo, Constantinople, Baghdad, or even further east, creating information channels that crossed political and cultural boundaries. Furthermore, Jewish scholars had preserved and transmitted much of the classical Greek and Roman geographical and scientific knowledge through the medieval period. When Islamic scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic during the Islamic Golden Age, Jewish scholars often participated in this work. Later, when these texts needed to be translated from Arabic into Latin for European audiences, Jewish scholars again played a crucial role. They were literally the bridges connecting different bodies of knowledge. The Majorcan cartographic school, based in Palma de Majorca in the late 1300s, was dominated by Jewish mapmakers and became famous throughout Europe for producing the finest maps and nautical charts available. The most celebrated was Abraham Cresques, creator of the magnificent Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most important medieval maps in existence. This atlas didn't just show coastlines. It included detailed information about the interior of Africa and Asia, trade routes, political kingdoms, and even ethnographic information about different peoples. Much of this information came from Jewish merchant networks and from Arab sources that Abraham Cresques could access through his linguistic skills. Abraham Cresques' son, Jehuda Cresques, later converted to Christianity under pressure and moved to Portugal, where he worked for Prince Henry the Navigator. Under his Christian name, Jaume Ribes, he became one of the key figures at Sagres, bringing with him the sophisticated cartographic traditions of the Majorcan school and access to source materials and techniques that the Portuguese had previously lacked. This pattern repeated throughout Portuguese exploration. Jewish astronomers created the astronomical tables used by Portuguese navigators to calculate latitude. Jewish mathematicians developed improved navigation instruments and techniques. Jewish translators made Arab and other foreign navigation texts accessible to Portuguese sailors who couldn't read the original languages. One of the most important was Abraham Zacuto, a professor of astronomy and mathematics at the University of Salamanca, who fled to Portugal in 1492 when Spain expelled its Jews. Zacuto created improved astronomical tables and an improved astrolabe design that were crucial for Portuguese navigation. His tables were used by Vasco da Gama on his voyage to India and by Columbus on his voyages to the Americas. Zacuto's work made it possible to calculate latitude with unprecedented accuracy while at sea, a revolutionary advance that fundamentally enabled long-distance ocean navigation. But then came catastrophe. In 1492, Spain issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling all Jews who refused to convert to Christianity. Approximately 200,000 Jews were forced to leave Spain, and many fled to Portugal. Portugal initially accepted these refugees, but under pressure from Spain and from the Catholic Church, King Manuel I issued his own expulsion decree in 1497. However, Portugal's expulsion was different from Spain's in a crucial way. Portugal needed the skills and knowledge that Jewish scholars possessed, particularly in areas like cartography, navigation, astronomy, and international trade. So while the official policy was expulsion, the practical implementation was forced conversion. Jews were told they could stay if they converted to Christianity. Many did, becoming new Christians or conversos. But many of these conversions were not sincere. They were survival strategies. These conversos often continued practicing Judaism in secret, becoming crypto-Jews or Marranos, derogatory terms meaning hidden Jews or pigs. The Portuguese Inquisition, established in 1536, was specifically designed to hunt down and persecute these crypto-Jews. Thousands were arrested, interrogated, tortured, and in many cases executed. The famous autos da fe, public ceremonies where convicted heretics were burned at the stake, became regular spectacles in Lisbon and other Portuguese cities. This persecution continued for centuries. As late as the 1700s, the Portuguese Inquisition was still prosecuting people for secretly practicing Judaism. The result was that many conversos and their descendants fled Portugal whenever they could, seeking refuge in places where they might practice their religion freely or at least face less persecution. Many went to the Netherlands, which became relatively tolerant in the 1500s and 1600s. Others went to the Ottoman Empire, which actively welcomed Jewish refugees. Still others went to North Africa, Italy, or the Americas. These refugees took their knowledge with them. Dutch cartography and navigation surged in the late 1500s and early 1600s, making the Netherlands the dominant maritime power of the era. This was not coincidental. Many of the leading Dutch cartographers, navigators, and merchants were Portuguese Jews or descendants of Portuguese Jews who had fled persecution. They brought with them the techniques, knowledge, and quite possibly copies of maps that they had learned or acquired in Portugal. Here's the cover-up. In official Portuguese histories written during and after the Inquisition period, the role of Jewish cartographers and scholars was systematically minimized, obscured, or erased entirely. Catholic Portugal couldn't acknowledge that much of its exploration success was built on Jewish scholarship. It was politically and religiously unacceptable to admit that conversos, people whose Christianity was suspect and who might be secretly practicing Judaism, were integral to Portugal's maritime achievements. Names were changed. Jewish scholars who had worked under their Hebrew names were referred to by Christian names they adopted after forced conversion, making it difficult to track their contributions. Genealogies were obscured. Family histories were rewritten. In some cases, the contributions of Jewish scholars were simply attributed to Christian Portuguese without acknowledgement of the actual creators. This erasure extended to physical evidence. Maps and documents that might have identified Jewish contributors were destroyed, hidden, or had identifying information removed. When the Inquisition arrested conversos, their personal libraries and papers were often confiscated and burned. Generations of scholarship and documentation literally went up in flames. Only in recent decades have historians begun systematically recovering this hidden history. By carefully examining Inquisition records, which ironically preserved information about conversos even while persecuting them, researchers have been able to reconstruct Jewish contributions to Portuguese exploration. By tracing family names, comparing different versions of historical documents, and analyzing the biographies of key figures in Portuguese maritime history, we can now see that Jewish and converso involvement was far more extensive than traditional histories acknowledged. We now know that Jewish and converso navigators sailed on many Portuguese expeditions. Some of the most important cartographers working in Lisbon in the late 1400s and early 1500s were conversos. The astronomical tables, navigation instruments, and mathematical techniques used by Portuguese sailors were often developed by Jewish scholars. Even the financing of some expeditions came from wealthy converso merchants who had the capital and international connections necessary for such expensive ventures. The Sagres Academy almost certainly included Jewish scholars in its early years before the expulsion, and conversos afterward. Prince Henry recognized talent and knowledge wherever he found it, and he was pragmatic enough to employ Jews when their skills were needed. After 1497, their presence became unofficial, hidden behind Christian names and identities, or simply not recorded in documents that might survive. This erasure represents one of the great losses in the history of science and exploration. We will never know the full extent of Jewish contributions because so much evidence was deliberately destroyed. We don't know how many maps were created by Jewish cartographers whose names were removed or changed. We don't know how many navigation techniques were developed by Jewish astronomers who couldn't be publicly acknowledged. We don't know how many expeditions were made possible by Jewish translators and interpreters whose work was essential but unrecorded. What we can say is this: the story of Portuguese exploration and the secret maps of Sagres cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the central role of Jewish scholarship. The Age of Discovery was not just a Portuguese achievement. It was a collaborative, multicultural enterprise that drew on knowledge from Christian, Jewish, and Muslim sources. The tragedy is that persecution and religious intolerance led to the erasure of crucial contributors, impoverishing our historical understanding and failing to honor those who made these achievements possible. The Portuguese policy of sigilo, absolute secrecy regarding navigation routes, cartographic information, and geographical discoveries, was one of the most comprehensive information control systems in history. It wasn't just informal or traditional, it was codified in law, enforced with severe penalties including execution, and integrated into every aspect of Portuguese maritime operations. Understanding how this system worked gives us insight into just how valuable geographical knowledge was in the Age of Discovery. The legal framework was established through a series of royal decrees beginning in the reign of King João II in the late 1400s and continuing through the 1500s. These laws made it explicitly illegal to export maps, navigation charts, or any documentation related to Portuguese discoveries without royal permission. The penalty for violation was death, and this was not an empty threat. People were actually executed for revealing Portuguese navigation secrets. Foreign mapmakers caught attempting to copy Portuguese charts or questioning Portuguese sailors about navigation routes could be arrested and imprisoned. Foreign merchants found in possession of Portuguese maps could have their property confiscated. Portuguese sailors who discussed navigation details with foreigners faced interrogation and punishment. The system was comprehensive and aggressively enforced. At the center of this system was the Casa da Índia, the royal institution in Lisbon that managed all overseas trade and exploration. Established in 1500, the Casa da Índia functioned as a combination trade ministry, customs house, navigation school, and intelligence agency. Every ship sailing to Asia, Africa, or the Americas had to be licensed by the Casa de India. Every captain had to be approved and licensed, every cargo had to be registered, and most importantly, every piece of navigation information had to be reported and controlled. The master charts, the comprehensive, accurate maps showing all Portuguese discoveries, were kept in a secure room within the Casa de India. Access was restricted to the Armazém da Guiné e India officials, the king, his closest advisors, and licensed pilots preparing for specific voyages. Even these pilots didn't see the complete charts. They were given navigation instructions relevant to their particular route, essentially need-to-know information only. When a Portuguese ship returned from a voyage, the captain was required to report immediately to the Casa de India for debriefing. This wasn't a casual conversation, it was a formal interrogation. Every detail of the voyage was recorded: where the ship went, what it saw, what measurements were taken, what inhabitants were encountered, what resources were available. This information was then integrated into the master charts by the official cartographers employed by the Casa de India. These cartographers were themselves closely monitored. They worked in secure facilities, their materials were controlled, their output was reviewed. They couldn't take work home or maintain private copies of the charts they created. Everything remained within the secure system, but legal controls and institutional procedures weren't enough. The Portuguese also employed active disinformation campaigns. They published false maps for foreign consumption, deliberately showing incorrect information designed to mislead rival nations. These false maps might show fictional islands blocking access to important routes. They might exaggerate distances, making journeys seem longer and more difficult than they actually were. They might misplace important landmarks or show coastlines in wrong positions. The purpose was to ensure that if foreign spies obtained Portuguese maps, they would get false information that would lead their expeditions astray. Meanwhile, the real maps, the accurate ones, remained locked away and accessible only to authorized Portuguese personnel. This was information warfare before the term existed, and it was remarkably effective. The Portuguese also employed counterintelligence operations. Foreign agents attempting to gather navigation intelligence were monitored and sometimes deliberately fed false information. Portuguese officials would occasionally, accidentally, let slip false details about routes or discoveries, knowing that foreign spies would report this misinformation to their governments. It's a sophisticated game that demonstrates just how seriously Portugal took information security. Economic incentives also supported the secrecy system. Licensed pilots and navigators were well-paid professionals with prestigious positions. They had strong incentives to maintain the system that gave them these benefits. Revealing secrets might bring a one-time payment from a foreign power, but it would also mean permanent exile from Portugal, loss of position and income, and possibly execution. Most decided the risk wasn't worth it. Yet despite all these measures, secrecy couldn't be maintained forever. The fundamental problem was that knowledge, once shared even with a limited group, inevitably spreads. Portuguese ships sailed with crews of dozens or hundreds of men. While the officers might be committed to secrecy, ordinary sailors were less reliable. They talked in ports, in taverns, to foreign merchants. Details leaked out gradually. Portuguese sailors defected to rival nations, taking their knowledge with them. Ferdinand Magellan is the most famous example, but he was far from the only one. Spanish, French, English, and Dutch authorities actively recruited Portuguese navigators, offering money, land, titles, and protection in exchange for their knowledge. Some defected for ideological reasons, others for personal grievances, still others simply for money. Each defection represented another breach in the wall of secrecy. Foreign spies successfully infiltrated Portuguese institutions. The Venetians, with their long tradition of intelligence gathering, were particularly skilled at this. So were the Spanish, who had the advantage of linguistic and cultural similarity to Portugal. Agents posing as merchants, sailors, or scholars would gradually work their way into positions where they could access restricted information, make copies of maps, or simply memorize crucial navigation details to report back to their governments. Pirates and privateers captured Portuguese ships, and with them their navigation charts. In the 1500s and early 1600s, as European naval warfare intensified, Portuguese vessels became targets for English, French, and Dutch raiders. Each captured ship represented another potential breach of secrecy, while captains were supposed to destroy charts if capture seemed imminent. This didn't always happen in the chaos of battle. The most catastrophic breach came in 1580, when Spain annexed Portugal in a dynastic union following the death of the Portuguese king without a clear heir. Suddenly, Spanish authorities had direct access to Portuguese archives, including the restricted cartographic materials in the Casa da India. While the union eventually ended in 1640, when Portugal regained independence, 60 years of Spanish access had already compromised many Portuguese secrets. During this period of union, the enemies of Spain were also the enemies of Portugal. English privateers like Francis Drake specifically targeted Portuguese and Spanish possessions, capturing ships and raiding coastal settlements. Drake's raid on Sagres in 1587 was explicitly aimed at destroying navigation resources and capturing charts. Dutch rebels fighting for independence from Spain targeted Portuguese colonies and ships as part of their broader war. In this chaotic environment, maintaining information security became nearly impossible. By the early 1600s, the age of Portuguese cartographic monopoly was effectively over. The Dutch, English, and French were all conducting their own explorations, creating their own maps, and establishing their own trade routes to Asia and the Americas. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, became the dominant maritime commercial power in Asia, surpassing Portugal. Dutch cartographers like Willem Bleu and cartographic firms like the House of Bleu in Amsterdam became the leading map producers, eclipsing Portuguese cartography. Yet the irony is that much of this new cartographic knowledge was built on Portuguese foundations. Dutch navigators used routes originally pioneered by Portuguese explorers. Dutch maps incorporated information originally gathered by Portuguese surveyors. The cartographic revolution of the 1600s didn't start from scratch. It built on the accumulated knowledge of Portuguese exploration from the 1400s and 1500s. The policy of sigillo, for all its comprehensiveness and all the resources devoted to maintaining it, ultimately could only delay the spread of knowledge, not prevent it entirely. Information wants to be free, as we might say today, but the delay mattered. For several crucial decades, Portugal maintained an information monopoly that allowed a small kingdom to dominate global trade and establish a maritime empire that stretched from Brazil to Japan. That achievement, even if temporary, was built on the secret maps of Sagres and the system of information control that protected them. Let me bring this full circle and talk about the profound impact that these Portuguese maps had on human history, human consciousness, and our understanding of our planet. Because the maps created at Sagres and in Lisbon were far more than navigation tools or trade secrets. They were instruments of epistemological revolution. They fundamentally restructured how humans understood the world and our place in it. Before the age of discovery, Europeans had a profoundly limited and often fantastical view of the world. They knew Europe reasonably well. They understood the Mediterranean. They had vague, often distorted knowledge of Asia based on travelers' tales and ancient texts. They knew Africa existed, but thought it was smaller than it actually is, and had bizarre ideas about what lay in its interior. They had no idea that the Americas existed at all. Medieval world maps, Mappae Mundi, like the famous Hereford Mappa Mundi or the Ebstorf map, weren't really designed for navigation. They were theological statements, showing the world as understood through Christian cosmology, with Jerusalem at the center, paradise at the top, and various biblical and legendary locations marked. Accuracy in the modern sense wasn't the point. Portuguese maps changed that fundamentally. They showed that Africa was enormous, far larger than Europe, and that it could be circumnavigated. They revealed that the Atlantic was crossable and that enormous continents existed on the other side. They demonstrated that Asia was accessible by sea, connected to Europe not just by overland routes but by ocean passages. They proved that the Earth was truly round, not flat, and that it could be sailed around completely. These weren't abstract intellectual discoveries. These were practical, verified facts demonstrated by actual voyages. When Vasco da Gama returned from India in 1499, he brought back spices, proof that the sea route worked. When Magellan's expedition returned in 1522, having circumnavigated the globe, it proved conclusively that the Earth was round and could be completely circled by sea. When Portuguese traders returned from Japan with Japanese goods and descriptions, it proved that the world extended far beyond what medieval Europeans had imagined. The psychological and philosophical impact was enormous. European scholars had to completely revise their understanding of geography, which in turn forced revisions in theology, natural history, anthropology, and eventually every field of knowledge. If the world was this much larger and more diverse than previously thought, what else might we be wrong about? The discovery of the Americas was particularly challenging to European intellectual frameworks. These continents weren't mentioned in the Bible or classical texts. The people living there weren't part of the existing understanding of human origins and biblical history. This forced European thinkers to grapple with profound questions. Where did Native Americans come from? Were they descended from Adam and Eve? Did they have souls? Could they be Christian? These questions had massive theological, moral, and political implications. Portuguese maps were also instruments of power and tools of colonialism. Accurate charts meant efficient trade routes, which meant economic advantage. They meant military expeditions could reach distant coasts with confidence, which meant conquest was possible. They meant European powers could establish colonies, extract resources, dominate indigenous populations, and reshape global commerce to benefit Europe at the expense of the rest of the world. The legacy of these maps is therefore deeply ambiguous, even troubling. They expanded human knowledge genuinely and significantly. The mapping of the world's coastlines was an extraordinary intellectual achievement that required courage, skill, persistence, and scientific rigor. But this knowledge was immediately weaponized for exploitation, slavery, and genocide. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, and French colonial empires were all built on the foundation of accurate cartographic knowledge that made global domination logistically possible. From a purely cartographic perspective, setting aside the moral complexities for a moment, the Portuguese achievement was extraordinary. In less than a century, roughly from 1420 to 1520, Portuguese navigators and cartographers mapped most of the world's coastlines with a level of accuracy that wouldn't be significantly improved until the development of precise longitude determination in the 1700s. Consider the scale of this achievement. In 1420, Europeans couldn't reliably navigate beyond the Mediterranean. By 1520, Portuguese maps showed Africa, both coasts of South America, India, Southeast Asia, and the beginning outlines of Australia and the Pacific. This represents perhaps the most rapid expansion of geographical knowledge in human history. Nothing comparable happened until the space age, when satellite imagery allowed us to map the Earth from orbit. Some of the most important surviving maps from this era include the Cantino Planisphere of 1502, which shows Portuguese discoveries in Africa, Asia, and Brazil with remarkable accuracy and is one of the oldest surviving maps to show the Americas. The Waldseemüller map of 1507 was the first to use the name America for the New World, based partly on Portuguese sources and Amerigo Vespucci's voyages. The Ribeiro map of 1529 shows the Pacific Ocean and the complex geography of Southeast Asia with impressive detail. But these surviving maps represent only a fraction of what was created. Most of the master charts from the Casa de India were lost in the 1755 Lisbon earthquake or in subsequent fires, wars, and disasters. What we have are mostly copies, often made for diplomatic purposes or captured by foreign powers, rather than the original master charts that represented the full extent of Portuguese knowledge. The maps that survived often show features that historians still puzzle over, coastlines that appear too accurate given the official timeline of exploration, islands that may or may not actually exist, notations in margins referring to discoveries not mentioned in any surviving documents. Each of these anomalies represents a potential mystery, a hint that the Portuguese knew more than official records indicate. Modern researchers using computer analysis have studied these old maps in new ways, comparing them to modern satellite data, analyzing their mathematical projections, and trying to understand how they were created. Some of this research has confirmed the extraordinary accuracy of Portuguese cartography. Other research has revealed distortions and errors that tell us about the limitations of 16th century surveying techniques. All of it deepens our appreciation for what these early cartographers achieved. Standing here, metaphorically, at Cape St. Vincent, looking out at the Atlantic just as those Portuguese cartographers did 5 centuries ago, I can imagine them working by candlelight in the fortress at Sagres. They're compiling information from dozens of sources, reports from returning captains, measurements taken at sea, descriptions from indigenous informants, fragments from ancient texts, intelligence from spies. They're trying to make sense of a world far larger and more complex than anyone had imagined, trying to fit all these pieces together into a coherent picture. They're drawing the world into existence, line by line, coast by coast, transforming the unknown into the known, turning myth and speculation into verifiable fact. It's an act of intellectual courage and creativity, but it's also an act with profound consequences, both magnificent and terrible. Their work connected the world. Before Portuguese exploration, human civilizations were largely isolated from each other. After Portuguese exploration, a truly global network of trade, communication, and cultural exchange became possible for the first time in human history. This globalization brought enormous benefits: the exchange of crops, technologies, ideas, and knowledge between continents. It also brought catastrophic costs, epidemic diseases that devastated indigenous populations, slavery on an unprecedented scale, the destruction of entire civilizations, and centuries of colonial exploitation. The secret maps of Sagres represent a pivotal moment when humanity moved from medieval isolation to global interconnection. For better and worse, we still live in the world those maps created. Every time you open a map app on your phone, every time you see a globe, every time you fly from one continent to another, you're experiencing the legacy of those Portuguese cartographers who first showed that the Earth could be measured, mapped, and navigated as a unified whole. Their achievement reminds us that knowledge is power, but also that power carries responsibility. The maps of Sagres opened the world, but what humanity chose to do with that open world was up to us, then and now. So we've reached the end of this journey through one of history's most fascinating mysteries. We've explored the fortress at Sagres, uncovered the secret academy of Prince Henry the Navigator, examined the Portolan charts that shouldn't exist, investigated what the Portuguese really knew and how they kept it secret for decades. analyzed the controversial Piri Reis map and the Antarctic coastline debate, recovered the hidden history of Jewish cartographers and the expulsion cover-up, and understood how these maps fundamentally changed human understanding of our world. But here's my question for you, and I really want to hear what you think. What do you believe the Portuguese really knew? Do you think they had access to ancient maps showing coastlines that shouldn't have been discovered yet, perhaps from lost civilizations or ancient seafaring cultures we don't know about? Or do you think the mystery is simpler, that the Portuguese were just extraordinarily skilled, systematic and thorough in their exploration and cartography, and that they kept their discoveries secret long enough to maintain a competitive advantage? Do you believe the Piri Reis map shows Antarctica, or is it just a distorted rendering of South America? Do you think there were Portuguese expeditions to places like Australia or the Pacific Islands decades before official discoveries, or is that speculation without sufficient evidence? What about the role of Jewish scholars? Do you think their contributions have been adequately recognized even now? Or is there still more hidden history to uncover? Drop your theories, your questions, your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you think about these mysteries. Are you more convinced by mainstream historical explanations, or do you lean toward alternative theories? What aspects of this story fascinate you most? What would you like to see explored in more depth? And if you found this journey into cartographic history as fascinating as I did, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, because we're just getting started. There are so many more hidden stories of exploration, secrets of ancient maps, and historical mysteries that mainstream narratives prefer to gloss over or ignore. I'm planning deep dives into other mysterious maps, like the Vinland map and pre-Columbian European contact with the Americas. The sophisticated navigation techniques of Polynesian sailors who mapped the Pacific using only stick charts and stars, the legendary maps of the Library of Alexandria and what was lost, and the bizarre and beautiful medieval Mappe Mundi and what they reveal about how our ancestors understood the world. If there are specific historical mysteries, cartographic puzzles, or exploration stories you want me to investigate, let me know in the comments. This channel is all about uncovering the hidden, questioning the official narratives, and discovering the real human stories behind historical achievements. Your input helps guide where we go next. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss future episodes. Turn on notifications so you're alerted when new content drops. And if you really enjoyed this video, share it with someone who loves history, mysteries, or maps. Help spread this story to people who will appreciate the complexity and fascination of the Age of Discovery. Leave a comment with your thoughts on the secret maps of Sagres, even if you just want to say which part of the story you found most interesting. I want to hear from you. Engagement helps this content reach more people, and more importantly, your comments create a community of people who are genuinely curious about these historical mysteries. The maps of Sagres may be lost, scattered, or locked away in archives we haven't fully explored, but their legacy continues. Every time you look at a world map, you're looking at the descendants of those Portuguese charts created at the edge of the world 500 years ago. The secrets may be partially revealed now, but the story, the human story of curiosity, ambition, brilliance, and the relentless drive to understand our world, that story never gets old. What drove Prince Henry and his cartographers wasn't just the desire for wealth or power, though those were certainly factors. It was something deeper, the fundamental human need to know what lies beyond the horizon, to transform the unknown into the known, to push against the boundaries of what's possible. That same drive sent humans to the moon, will send us to Mars, and compels us to ask questions, even when the answers are difficult or uncomfortable. The Age of Discovery, for all its moral complexities and troubling legacies, was ultimately about that human drive to explore and understand. The Portuguese, working from a fortress at the edge of what was then the known world, managed to map the entire globe in less than a century. They did it through systematic methodology, international collaboration, the integration of diverse knowledge sources, and yes, secrecy and information control. But they did it. And now, 500 years later, we have the privilege of looking back and trying to understand how they accomplished it, what they really knew, where they got their information, and why so much remains mysterious despite centuries of scholarship. That's what makes this story endlessly fascinating. There are still questions without definitive answers, still documents that might emerge from forgotten archives, still new ways of analyzing old maps that might reveal new insights. So thank you for joining me on this exploration of the secret maps of Sagres and how Portugal drew the world. Remember to subscribe, comment, and share this video. Let's keep exploring these mysteries together. Let's keep questioning, investigating, and discovering the hidden stories of human achievement, because the more we understand about where we've been, the better we can understand where we might be going. The world is still full of mysteries waiting to be uncovered. Let's go find them together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Now go explore.